This week we're reading Parshas Eikev, and let's get right into some absolutely beautiful inyanim in this week's Parsha. The Torah begins by telling us, the name of the Parsha, V'haya Eikev tishma'un esam mishpatim ha'ela ushmartem v'asisam osam. And the Art Scrolls translation is V'haya Eikev tishma'un, and it will be because of your listening to these ordinances, and you observing and performing them. And Hashem, your God, will safeguard for you the covenant and the kindness that he swore to your forefathers. Rashi, as all the other Mefarshim, is bothered by the word Eikev. And Rashi says, V'haya Eikev tishma'un, and it will be because of your listening. Im hamitzvos hakalos, if the relatively light, easy mitzvos, sha'adam dash ba'akevo, that a person tramples with his heels, akev, and what does that mean? He doesn't take those mitzvos seriously. Tishma'un, you shall listen to. Because if you're listening to the mitzvos that a person doesn't really take that seriously. Okay, mitzvos that a person doesn't, the mitzvos don't seem significant, don't seem important. Maybe there's not a big reward for the mitzvos. And so Rashi's telling us that why didn't the Torah use the word im tishmu es hamishpatim? If you listen, it will be if you listen. Therefore, Eikev teaches me that the word Eikev means heel, and it teaches me that idea that you listen to these mitzvahs which people don't take so seriously. And all the Mefarshim discuss where did Rashi get that, and that's what we're going to see here in Rav Mordechai Druk in his Sefer Drash Mordechai. So first, obviously, here he quotes Rashi, which we just did here on line 1. Ubarashi v'haya Eikev tishmun im hamitzvos hakalash adam dash ba'akevo tishmun. We have to investigate. We have to do some research, says Rav Druk. Madua nota Rashi milafarish kipshuto k'mokol Torah. Why did Rashi have to go ahead and say that the word Eikev means heel, which is not the way it's normally translated in other places in the Torah? We see the word Eikev. The Eikev hainu beglal, we see the word Eikev means because of. Eikev asher shama Avram b'koli, because you listen to my voice, Avram, the Torah says earlier in Parshas told us. So there it means because of, beglal. How come here in Parshas Eikev, Rashi isn't translating it that way? He's translating it the way Eikev means a heel, something that you trample upon. V'chein, Rav Druk continues, and he says, "V'chein tzarich be'er dinei v'parshosenu nemar dal shmiras hamishpatim levad maftiach lanu hakadosh baruch hu avtachas bli gvul." If you look in the as the parsha continues, Hakadosh Baruch Hu is giving us brachos if we listen to all the mishpatim, if we listen to all the rules. For example, he says here, as the psukim continue, at the beginning of Parshas Eikev, V'shomer Hashem l'chasa bris v'sachesed asher nishba alav secha, that Hakadosh Baruch Hu will keep the bris and the chesed that he promised to your forefathers. Va'evecha ve'racha u'be'rak pri ritnecha for yad masecha degancha v'tiroshcha v'tzarecha shigara lafecha v'ashtero sonecha. All the wonderful brachos that Hakadosh Baruch Hu will give us. And then it says, you will be the most blessed of all the nations in the world. There won't be any infertility amongst you, and in your animals either. And all the bad maladies that of Egypt that you knew, Hashem will not put upon them, but he will put them on your enemies. You will devour all the people, where Hashem will deliver you. So the so-called Avtachos Nemar, in the middle of these Tukim, as I just translated for you, it says, quote, V'chol madvei Mitzrayim, and all the bad maladies of Egypt, lo yasimbach, Hashem will not put upon you, unesanam b'chol sonecha, and they will be on your enemies. The Ilu Parshas B'Shalach, and if you look back in Parshas B'Shalach, right after Yitzias Mitzrayim, a pasuk that we're all familiar with, it says, "B'chdei l'schus rak l'avtacha shel kol hamachla asher samti b'Mitzrayim lo asim alach ki ani Hashem rofecha," a similar promise that all the diseases that I placed in Egypt, I will not bring upon you, ki ani Hashem rofecha, because I am Hashem, your healer. There's much more to it. It says, "Shamoa tishma kol Hashem Elokecha, vayosher bein avtaseh, vazanta l'mitzvosav." It's a much greater degree of listening, of adhering to the mitzvos, as opposed to b'shamar Hashem Elokecha, that if you Eikev tishmun, if you keep even the lighter mitzvos, I'll give you these tremendous brachos. But way back in B'Shalach, it was much more extensive. Shamoa tishma kol Hashem Elokecha, v'hayosher bein avtaseh, v'azanta l'mitzvosav, shamarta kol kucha. Then after those requirements, those conditions, because I am Hashem, your healer. So how do we contrast Parshas B'Shalach, where the Torah gives us that promise of not bringing maladies upon us, diseases upon us, with all those requirements, as opposed to here, where it is, you keep the mitzvahs that people trample upon, look at the tremendous brachas you're going to get. Says Rav Druk, one answer, once we give one answer, we will see that both questions will be answered. Why? So he explains. L'Rashi hayakashem. Rashi had a question. Rashi was bothered by just by keeping these mishpatim. Remember, how does our parsha begin? V'haya Eikev tishmun esam mishpatim ela. You're going to keep these ordinances, these rules. So why b'shvil shmiras hamishpatim levad magia schar kazek gadol? You're going to get such great reward, as we showed you earlier in the psukim in today's parsha. L'chein perish. Kikan, that's why Rashi has to tell us here in Parshas Eikev. Eina Torah medaberes me'asiyas hamishpatim levad. It's not only talking about keeping the mitzvos alone. It's not only just your adherence and your commitment to the mitzvos. Ela shmira me'avonas sha'adam dash be'kavo. But we're talking about the mitzvos that a person tramples upon, that a person doesn't seem significant, that a person makes trivial, so to speak. Vizu, line 20. Vizu yavodat dechashan ma'od. And that becomes a very difficult concept. You'll see why, as Rav Druk will explain. It's not something that's so easy, where there are mitzvos that people don't take seriously or think are insignificant. David HaMelech himself was fearful if he was even able to fulfill mitzvos that, again, quote unquote, seemed somewhat insignificant. What does the Medrash say? So he quotes it here in line 22, line 21. V'haya Eikev teshmun, it says, V'haya Eikev teshmun, zeh she'amar. That is the pshat in the pasuk, that in Tehillim, where it says, Lama ira bimei rea avon akavi yisuveni. Okay, why should I be fearful in the days of evil, when the mitzvos that I trod upon will surround me? Avon akeva yisuveni. Avon akeva yisuveni. The sins of those that I trample upon, that I trod upon, yisuveni, surround me. David HaMelech said that in Tehillim. What does that mean? Amar David, the Medrash explains, what does David HaMelech mean? I'm not so scared from those difficult, hard mitzvos, because they're difficult to do. Aval ani misyorim min hakalos. I'm more afraid of the easy mitzvos, which we'll talk about in a moment. Shemo avarti alehem. Maybe I transgressed those. I'm not scared about the difficult ones. It's the easy ones that I'm fearful of. And David says, speaking in effect to the Ribbon Shalom, and you told us that we have to be careful, as it says in Pirkei Avos, you have to be careful in an easy mitzvah as you are with a more difficult mitzvah. Lakach ne'amar, that's why the pasuk says, V'haya Eikev tishmun, you have to keep the mitzvahs, even the easy ones. So that's what the Medrash says. Listen to what Rav Druk says. The Hiksha Kli Yakar, on that Medrash, if you look in the Kli Yakar here in today's Parsha, right at the beginning of Parsha Eikev, Zel Lashono, this is a question that Kli Yakar asks on that Medrash. I searched the entire text of the Torah. David HaMelech said, you, God, said, and I'm nervous that I'm not going to be able to fulfill the easy mitzvos. The difficult ones I could do. The easy ones I'm afraid. And you said that we have to be Zorak b'mitzvah kal v'chamura. Yes, it's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, but David said that HaKadosh Baruch Hu said that. Where did HaKadosh Baruch Hu say it? He searched the entire Mikra, and I didn't find where HaKadosh Baruch Hu said that. But David v'yata Marta. How can the Medrash say that God said you should be Zahir? Where does God say that? Umetaretz. And the Kli Yakar answers, the Al-Kochar pasuk zeh, our pasuk here at the beginning of Parshas Eikev, makor lakach. Makor lakach. This is where HaKadosh Baruch Hu said it, which is exactly why Rashi explained it this way, because this is the pasuk that tells us that you have to be zahir in a mitzvah kala v'chamura, haya Eikev tishmon. Lakach. Which are kalos, which are light, which are insignificant in the eyes of the nation. And they trod upon them with their heels. And if you're careful on those mitzvahs, which people aren't careful about, so then you're going to get this great reward, as the Torah delineates in the beginning of Parshas Eikev. Line 30, Rav Druk continues, and he says, Al derech mashal, he says, I want to give you an example. How it appears when we hear that bracha, which Amir Hashem will hear in a few weeks, in a little over a month, where we hear the bracha lishmoa kol shofar, to hear the sound of the shofar for Rosh Hashanah. Kiros Beis HaMedrash mizdazim. The walls of the Beis HaMedrash start shaking. When we're about to hear that sound of the shofar, and the answering amen that happens after you hear that bracha l'shmo kol shofar, everybody says amen with tremendous kavanah. Oh Yoser, how much they're in tuned literally to the bracha of l'shmo kol shofar and the sound of the shofar. However, the ilu birchas hamazon. But what about the mitzvah of birchas hamazon, benching, shahumida oraisa, which is a mitzvah in the Torah in this week's parsha, which Amir Hashem will get to in a few minutes. Nemeres b'chataf u'mehiras. We say benching very quickly. We do it by heart. We do it very quickly, and it's a mitzvah d'oraisa. The apetz al nashim gedolim nadir liros shivarchu birchas hamazon b'kazu otzma. Right? And even through great people, we see how they're saying Birchas HaMazon in such a fashion. Birchas HaShofar, the bracha of shofar, Lishmoa kol shofar, all brachos of the Rabbanon except benching. Again, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. You can blow the shofar without a bracha. So let's say you blow the shofar, you didn't make a bracha, you still yotze. But we hear the bracha l'shmoa kol shofar, we listen intently, we don't answer baruch hu v'chshemo, we answer amen with such kavana. The bracha of shofar is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. The bracha of Birchas Hamazon is a mitzvah d'oraisa. How do we weigh it one against each other? Ulam, hahergel shochech hasakavana. The difference is, very clearly, it's called hergel. It's called routine. We bench every day, sometimes 2-3 times a day. So we so used to it, we just do it, by rote. Shmuel called shofar twice a year. This year, only once a year, Mir Hashem, coming up just on second day Rosh Hashanah, on Sunday. Shabbos, there's no shofar. And the contrast between the two brachos. Ulam hahergel shochek esakavana lo birchas hamazon birchas mevarkas pam bashana. If birchas hamazon was a bracha we do once a year, haisaniras acheres lagamre. You can imagine what the kavana of birchas hamazon would be. Zeh kavanas mitzvah shadam dash ba'kevo. That's what the pshat is. The mitzvos that people trample upon with their heel. Koach hahergel shola alehem. The routine. The pattern, we do it all the time, we're used to it. That's what's overtaking us. Zu avoda kasha admod. That's what David HaMelech said is very difficult. Something that you do constantly, you do every day, it becomes normal, it becomes routine, you don't think about it. I can talk for myself, you put your tefillin on your arm, make the bracha, let's go, let's daven, let's go to work. Okay? Do something once a year, you have such kavanah, right? And that's what it means, dash ba'kevo. Not an insignificant mitzvah, but a mitzvah that you're used to doing, that you have hergel, that you have a routine, that it's not something that's unique. It's part of your everyday life. Same things, say kriya shema l'ritu properly. Think about before whom you're saying the bracha. Just once, to remove the hergel, the routine. Kayotze bazeh, similar, Rav Druk N concludes, the inyan shmiras hapeh, what we say, mibli mesim adam midavar devorim asurim midvorim betelim sheker chanufa lashon hara v'chilos v'hadiburim mizgaldim v'holchem mibli mesim. People say things they don't think. They just talk. Their mouth is engaged before their brain. And we say things, Rahmana Litzlan, which are filled with Isurei D'Oraisa. If we would think before we talk and think about what the Dash Ba'Kevo, not to trample upon all the mitzvos that have to do with speech. That's very difficult. But that's why the pasuk says at the beginning here of Eikev, if you do the mitzvahs that people are dash ba'kevo, that they trample upon, meaning, as Rav Druk just explained, that it means mitzvahs that we are routinely we do all the time, and you do that well, and you don't act like it's just routine. Scharo harbe ma'od. There's tremendous schar in that. As the parsha continues, Moshe Rabbeinu tells the Klal Yisrael that he's taking them into Eretz Yisrael, and then he says, you should remember the entire path that I led you, for these 40 years, Bamidbar, Leman Anoscha, Lenasoscha, in order that I afflict you and to test you, whether you will observe the mitzvahs or not. And then the Torah says, Hashem afflicted us, and he let you go hungry, and he fed us the man, asher lo yadata, that you didn't know, v'lo yadun avosecha, nor did your forefathers know, laman hodiacha, in order that to make known to you, ki lo al alechem levado yichya adam, ki hakol motza pi Hashem yichya adam. Because man does not live by bread alone, by everything that comes from the mouth of Hashem, that's how man lives. Rav Moshe Feinstein has a tremendous thought here on this pasuk, here in the Drash Moshe. Vay'ancha vayarivecha, says Rav Moshe, nira, in my opinion, ki im lo hayam mislonim al shalo if Klal Yisrael did not complain for the lack of food, if they didn't complain about food, then an unbelievable nace would have happened and they wouldn't have to eat for the 40 years. You hear what I just said? Or not what I said, what Moshe said. If they didn't complain that there was no food, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu would have done a nace that food would have been unnecessary for the 40 years in the desert. Okay? You'll see what he means, and he's going to prove it in a moment. Ach mitzad choser emuna, but because of their lack of emuna, shal yisvurim she'iyafshar below zeh, because they thought that it's impossible to live without food, v'schil lidog, and they got worried, ulehis lo nein, kasher adayin lo yirevim, and they complained before they were yet hungry. They said, their food's run out, now what are we going to do? But we're not yet hungry. They weren't starving yet, and they started to complain immediately. Garam, that caused them shelo zachu lezeh. They weren't zocha to that tremendous nace that they wouldn't have to eat for the 40 years in the desert. Then they became hungry until God was forced to give them the man. I said something similar, says Rav Moshe. Look back in Sefer Bamidbar, Parak Lamed Gimel, Beferish Vayitzma Shama Amlamayim, where they were thirsty for water. If they didn't complain about the water, they wouldn't need to have had water for the 40 years in the desert. Therefore, says Rav Moshe, Nechshav Zeh Gamkein Me'achatam. That was considered a sin that they complained and were upset about the lack of food and the lack of water. Even though ultimately they asked properly, as the Gemara itself says, the bread they asked, when they asked for meat, that was not appropriate. Remember when they asked, they had meat and we want to eat meat, etc. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought the slav, he brought the quail. That the Gemara says they asked that was an inappropriate request. Why? Because they had cattle. We know they had cattle from all the korbanos. So they had meat. They just said, well, we don't want to kill our cattle. We don't want to shecht our cattle. We want Hashem to give it to us. So that was Shaloka Hogan. That the lack of meat showed them to be K'tanei Amuna. V'hevi akra raya lahem. Okay, and I'm going to bring a pasuk to prove it. Because what does it say in the next couple of pasukim? The next pasuk, after this pasuk here in Parshas Eikev, it says, I gave you the man. And then the next pasuk is, Hareyatem roim shesim lascha lo bolsa. What does the next pasuk say? The next pasuk here in Parshas Eikev says, Sim lascha lo bolsa me'alecha. Your garments did not wear out from upon you. And your feet did not swell for these 40 years. Why didn't they say there's no place to get clothes? Why didn't they say we have no stores to go shopping for shoes? They didn't say that. So you see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made a nace, and they didn't have to have new clothes for the 40 years. Hashem made a nace that the clothes were clean, and they grew with them. So Rav Moshe says the same thing would have happened with the food. If they didn't complain about it, you would have had to have no food for the 40 years. Okay, you didn't complain about it, you didn't ask for it. You didn't need new clothes, you didn't need new shoes. And the same thing would have been with bread. But you didn't have faith, and you asked for bread, so I gave him the nace. That's vaya'ancha vayarivecha. I afflicted you, and I let you go hungry, and I gave you the man. Laman hodiach hakilo alechem levado yichya adam ki al kol motza pi Hashem yichya ha'adam. Parsha continues. Moshe Rabbeinu reviews much of what happened in the Midbar. And then there's a fascinating discussion and a pasuk in the middle. if you take a look at in Perek Yud, Moshe Rabbeinu was reviewing that Hakadosh Baruch Hu told him to come back up the mountain, and I'm going to give you the second set of luchos after the Egel. And Moshe says, "Okay, I made an aron, and I carved out the Shnei Luchos Karishonim. I went up to the mountain, and I then Hakadosh Baruch Hu wrote it down. Vayichtav al luchos k'michtav harishon esaseres advarim asher diber Hashem aleichem bahar mitoch esh." And Hakadosh Baruch Hu wrote engraved on the luchos, the second set of luchos, what was on the first set of luchos. And then he said, "Va'ef and va'erid min ahar." I turned down. I came down the mountain, and va'simus haluchos ba'aron asher asisi. And he put the aron, the luchos, in the aron that he had made. Vayusham kasher tivani Hashem, and they were there as Hashem commanded. And then the Torah says, Vayusham, Bnei Yisrael nasu be'eros Bnei Yakon Moseira, and then Bnei Yisrael traveled from Bnei Yakon to Moseira. Sham Meis Aaron ve'yikaver Sham ve'yichayin Elazar b'no Tachtav. He says they traveled from Moseros, and that's where Aaron died. So Rashi talks about that he didn't die there; he died in Har Har. But the question is, which Rashi also talks about, is that didn't happen after Moshe Rabbeinu came down the mountain. Moshe Rabbeinu came down the mountain in the first year. Aaron died in the 40th year. And then, by the way, the pasuk continues and says, "Ba'esahi Yavdil Hashem Eshevet Alevi," says Aaron Bris Hashem, and that's when Hakadosh Baruch Hu separated the Leviim, which we know happened also back in the first year. So, what does this pasuk have to do? Aaron's death have to do with the Egel, etc. And of course, the Gemara says, and Rashi quotes it, that the Misas Tzadikim is kasha misas shel tzadikim v'nei HaKadosh Baruch Hu kiyom shenishtabru haluchos, as bad as the day that the luchos were broken. But there's more to it, and that's what Rav Nissen Alpert is going to show us. Look at this: Bnei Yisrael nasu misham, and Bnei Yisrael traveled from there. Nasu misham. Nasu Sham Meisar, Bnei Yisrael Nasu Sham Meisaron ve'yikaver Sham ve'yichayin Elazar b'no Tachtav. That's the pasuk in the parsha. V'yafal pisha ze'ira b'shnas arba. Even though Aaron's death happened in the 40th year, u'shviras haluchos ha'yisa b'shana rishona sheyatzu Mitzrayim, and the breaking of the luchos was in the first year after they left Egypt. Lomdu mikan chazal, the Yerushalmi tells us mikan shekasha misadikim v'nei HaKadosh Baruch Hu shviras haluchos, as Rashi also quotes here in this pasuk. V'nira, and in my opinion, there's something going on here. She'inyan shviras haluchos nishna harbe pamim b'nei Yisrael. The concept of the shviras haluchos was repeated many times throughout Klal Yisrael. That idea of the breaking of the luchos, which we'll get into more in a moment, is something that has unfortunately been repeated throughout the history of the Jewish people. Churban Beis Rishon Bayesheni Misas Adikim Hey Me'ein Shviras Haluchos. The Churban of the first Beis HaMikdash, the second Beis HaMikdash, the death of Tzadikim is similar to the Shviras Haluchos. Ubeir Hadavar Nirali. He says, I want to explain it to you as follows. Hu kisoser almenas livnos. It is destroying for the sake of building. What does that mean? At the time of Matan Torah, the Bnei Yisrael were not zoche to be on such a high level, me'atzman, themselves. Ella shal yideze shenasam HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'roma piska. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they needed divine assistance to be brought up on such a high level. HaKadosh Baruch Hu lifted them up, so to speak, to the great level of where they were at Matan Torah. The kacha hurgalu, lihishan al isrusa de la'ela mibli amo. and they got used to being on a high level, miblila amo, without having any hard effort to reach a high level. A person could achieve greatness because they work, they toil, they're hard, or a person could just be lifted up to such a position. Klal Yisrael, says Rav Alpert, Klal Yisrael at Har Sinai were lifted up by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and they got used to being there without their hard work, without any effort on their own. The Kevan She'enim Omdim Al Raglayim, since they weren't standing on their own 2 feet, Ella b'siyur mila'ela, only because HaKadosh Baruch Hu helped them get up there. B'shini koldu yiplu gamar madregosam. Therefore, when it gets a little shaky, they're going to fall down completely. If they worked hard and they built themselves up, they could have stayed there. But they never built themselves up. They were only there because HaKadosh Baruch Hu held them there. So if something gets shaky, if that changes a little bit, they're going to fall down. The Ze'ira, and that's exactly what happened. Kishallah Moshe Hashemayim lekabel luchos, and Moshe Rabbeinu went up, and all of a sudden, Moshe is a little bit delayed according to their cheshbon. He's delayed. They don't know where he is. We have to do something to replace Moshe Rabbeinu. Uveshviras haluchos, and as the luchos were broken, Heyid Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe showed the tremendous kedusha that there was the possibility in the world. You saw what kedusha there was by the first luchos. They were carved out and written by HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. And now we have to go down a little bit. Why? Well, these luchos, Moshe Rabbeinu had to carve himself. These were man-made, not God-made. Okay? The luchos were, that's where they belong. Moshe Rabbeinu made it. Perish. Because they were what Moshe did, Moshe's effort, they stayed there. When Moshe Rabbeinu made an effort, that's where they were able to stay. As Klal Yisrael continued, there was a Beis HaMikdash. And Klal Yisrael said, oh, we don't have to do anything. If God forbid we sin, we can bring a korban. Or, that's the source of Kedusha is the Beis HaMikdash. He says, Al shesamchu al kaparas hakabonos kedushas Beis HaMikdash, aval lo niskachu bekedushas Beis HaMikdash. Okay, what does that mean? They relied upon the holiness of the karbanos, of the holiness of the Beis HaMikdash, but they didn't realize the inherent kedusha that they themselves could do. The kachi gam came to misa sadikim, and that is a similar idea where the people didn't do anything on their own. They relied on others. They relied on karbanos. They relied on the Beis HaMikdash, or they rely on the tzaddik. Hatzadik chai ba'olam v'som malav avleinu yigim l'rom matzam l'kabel hadrachas hatzadik. The tzaddik is going to protect us. I can do whatever I want, but the tzaddik, he's the one who's protecting us. V'kama panim einish mason levu poshe yad lazar tzaddik. Alamatil akol alav shu yas akol. Well, let the tzaddik do it. He doesn't need my help, and whatever I do, I do. We rely on Moshe Rabbeinu, we rely on the Beis HaMikdash, we rely on the Karbanos, we rely on the Tzaddikim, but we ourselves don't necessarily put effort into things. What happened at the time of the Egel? People didn't object. Aaron, he's going to take care of it. Let's sit back and watch what happens. They said, we're going to rely on Aaron. People didn't take an initiative. Because there was bad and nobody stepped up to the plate. Nesaf HaTzadik. The tzaddik was taken. Zemasha Amar Akasav. Masha Amar Moshe Rabbeinu Khan. Sha'aron Meis Pesha Shemidaber Odos Shviras Aluchos. Aaron died at the time that we're talking about the Luchos. What's the connection between the Luchos and Aaron's death? Lahochicham, Aaron mates. Aaron died. He physically died in the 40th year. But their concept of letting Aaron be in charge, Aaron mace lobish nasar bam, ella sham mace Aaron basiyas egel. They actually, figuratively, not physically, killed Aaron at the time of the Egel. They realized that we'll rely on him, but it's not us. And they relied on Aaron. That's not who Aaron was. And therefore, says Rav Alpert, that is the idea here behind the juxtaposition of the Luchos and Aaron's death. Torah tells us, as we mentioned a few moments ago, the mitzvah of Birchas Hamazon, the mitzvah of benching, which is found in this week's parsha. The Torah tells us, "V'achalta v'savatu uveirachta es Hashem Elokecha ala oretz hatova asher nasan lach." Right, the mitzvah to eat and then to be satisfied and to then say a bracha ala oretz hatova asher nasan lach, land, the great land that Hashem has given us. Okay, the Balaturim writes, he says, if you look at the next pasuk right after that, Hishamer lacha, you should be careful. Pentishkach es Hashem Elokecha, lest you forget Hashem your God. Pentishkach es Hashem Elokecha, lest you forget Hashem your God. Levilti shmor mitzosav v'mishpatav v'chukosav asher anochi mitzavach hayom, that I commanded you today. And the the Balaturim writes, "V'achalta v'savata v'samach le'pen tishkach." What's the connection between pasuk Yud Aleph here and pasuk Yud? Shetzarich lahaski yom hamisa b'birchas hamazon. We have to mention the day of death in benching, lest you forget to keep the mitzvahs. Lakach, therefore, he says, tiknu hatov hametiv al haruge beitar shednitnu l'kfura. That is why Chazal established the bracha of hatov hametiv based on the haruge beitar, those who were killed in Beitar. So that's a Gemara in Brachos on Daf Mem Ches Amud Beis. The Gemara tells us in Brachos that the 4 brachos of benching were established by different people. The Gemara says, Moshe tikein lahem liyisrael birchas hazon b'shah shayad lahem es haman. Moshe Rabbeinu established the first bracha, hazanas hakol, when the man came down. The Gemara continues and says, Yehoshua tikein lahem birchas haaretz kevan shenichnus la'aretz. Yoshua composed the bracha, the second bracha of Noda, al haaretz, the al hamazon, when Klal Yisrael entered the land of Israel. David Shlomo, together, Tiknu Bonei Yerushalayim, composed the bracha of Bonei Yerushalayim. David Tikein al Yisrael Amecha ve'Yisrael Merecha. David, who conquered Yerushalayim, composed the part of the bracha Rachem Al Yisrael Amecha ve'Yisrael Merecha, on Yisrael and Yerushalayim. Ushlomo Tikein, and Shlomo HaMelech, who's the one who built the Beis HaMikdash, he was the one who composed Al Habayis Hadov HaKadosh. So that's the third bracha of benching. The fourth bracha of benching is Hakel Avinu Malkeinu Adireno. It's called Hatov HaMeitiv, and the Gemara says, B'Yavne Tiknuha. It was established in the city of Yavne, Keneged Haruge Beitar, on the account of the people, the Jews who were killed in Beitar. The city of Beitar was where the Bar Kokhba rebellion against Rome, that was his base where it occurred. And when the Romans defeated the Bar Kokhba rebellion and they slaughtered, the Gemara tells us, hundreds of thousands of Jews, and they denied the Jews their burial. They were not allowed to bury those that were killed. And the Gemara tells us, Chazal tell us, that after a couple of years, the leaders of the Jewish people, Rabbi Gamliel, they davened, and they also ended up bribing, the Gemara tells us, until finally permission was given to bury them. And a nace happened that the dead bodies did not decompose and they didn't rot, they didn't have an odor. And that's what the Gemara says. Tiknu b'yavna hatova metiv. Hatov shelo isrichu. The phrase hatov, who is good, refers to the fact that miraculously the bodies did not decay. The hametiv shenitnu l'kvura. And the phrase hametiv, who confers good, refers to the fact that they were ultimately allowed to be buried. And that's the Gemara in Brachos saying that we have to mention Yom HaMisa. The Baal HaTurim says, and that is why this bracha was established in benching. The Meshech Chachma comes along and he says, I got to tell you something else. He says as follows. He says, V'yesh lahavin. We have to understand. Masha amru atova meitiv b'yavna tiknu al haruge beitar. That it says that the Atova Meitiv, the Bracha Atova Meitiv was established on the Haruge Beitar. Tzarech Hezber, we have to understand it. I have to see what's going on here. Dalinyan Prate Tiknu Chacham and Bracha Kavua. This is a one-time event that happened in Jewish history. Granted, it's a great miracle, something that happened, but we've had other miracles that happened throughout Jewish history. And do we have a bracha that's established for them? Yes, we have a Pesach, we have a Sukkot, but those are Klal Yisrael in general, Yetzias Mitzrayim. But here we had this miracle. Again, granted, it was a tremendous miracle, but they established a bracha to be said in benching. And why benching? We'll answer in a minute. To commemorate this nace. The alin and prati tiknu chacham bracha kavua. Va'od, more than that, we know the bracha which is called atova meitiv al shinu yayin sarot levarach atova meitiv. The Gemara tells us if a person has a higher quality wine, some type of great wine that he's tasting good to the palate. So that brought him say atova meitiv. What's the connection? V'zepela. This is a tremendous question, says the Meshech Chachma. Madua rak. We continue over here. Rak al yayin. Why on wine? We have the bracha atova meitiv. And Tosfos and Psachim and the Rush talk about it too. But here's what the Meshech Chachma has to say. Va'beir. Tremendous idea. He says, "The kol birchas hamazon nitakna al binyan ha'uma." Benching was established on the building of the nation. In other words, if you think about it, Birchas Hamazon is a history of the Jewish people. And it's supposed to give us emunah in our past, our present, and you'll see ultimately the future. Moshe Rabbeinu, the bracha of the man, and Yehoshua, Eretz Yisrael. And in that bracha of Eretz Yisrael of Noda, it talks about a bris milah. It talks about Emunah, talks about Eretz Yisrael, talks about Torah. That's the second bracha. And then the third bracha is Yushalayim and the Beis HaMikdash. These are the Yesodos of Klal Yisrael. These are the foundations of Klal Yisrael. So the whole benching is to give us a insight of what we're all about. The whole Birchas HaMazon, we sit down where HaKadosh Baruch Hu has fed us. We're now satisfied. We want to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We have to look at the bigger picture. We're members of Klal Yisrael. He says, "The whole Birchas Hamazon nisakna binyan ha'uma shenivnes tzivcha be'etzba hashkacha." We've all been a product of tremendous hashkacha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's providence over us. V'zeh hashkacha pratis b'amon b'midbar, and the hashkacha pratis of HaKadosh Baruch Hu providing the man for us in the midbar. V'nizdaku nafshosam kol b'mshana, and he purified our souls for 40 years. V'lamdu muskolos elokim, and we learned the wisdom of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as the Gemara, as the Medrash tells us, lo nitna Torah lo ochlei aman. Okay. The Torah was given to the Ochlei Aman because that provided for us, that made us into a nation. The Hayolam Eretz, Yerushalayim Merkaz Aretz, we had a land now, and Yerushalayim is the center of the land. The Beis HaMikdash Shachan Shmo Olav, and the Beis HaMikdash was where HaKadosh Baruch Hu dwelt within it. The Hisnai b'nisim ritzufim tamid, and as the Chazal tell us that there were nisim that happened all the time. It says in Pirkei Avos, Asar and Nisyonos Nasu Avasena B'Yavne and the Beis Hamikdash. I mean, okay. So that's what we say in the first three brachas of benching. Aval, listen to this. Aval ha'amnam ha'tova meiktiv. What's this idea of the bracha of ha'tova meiktiv? Tiknu al kiyum ha'uma ha'bodedes b'moadel lios halechas b'gola ze alpayim shana. When was this bracha established? After the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, and less than a century after that with the Bar Kokhba rebellion and the basically giving up hope of the Jews ultimately reestablishing themselves within the foreseeable future. And Klal Yisrael Chachamim knew that there was going to be a long, long galus ahead for, as we see, Alpayim Shana, 2,000 years. V'hi kayemes berucha v'hoda v'tevarta. And Klal Yisrael still survives, despite the fact that we were given up, and despite the fact that we were without a land, without a Beis Hamikdash, we're in Galus, we have been put, so to speak, and you'll see in a minute more than this, put out the pasture. However, as we're going to read in next week's Haftorah, any weapon sharpened against them will not succeed. They thought after the Churban that the nation would not last. And they're going to be like gypsies. They're going to be like nomads, traveling from country to country without any real future, without any connection. When they saw that they weren't going to rely on the Bar Kokhba for him to reestablish the Jewish Commonwealth, and even Gedolei Olam were wrong about him. Chazal, we all know that Rabbi Akiva was the one who was thought that Bar Kokhba, the Rambam tells us that Bar Kokhba could have been the Mashiach. He could have been the one to save the Jewish people, but he wasn't. But then, after a while, when they saw that the Haruge Beitar were taken care of, their bodies didn't rot, and they were finally put to Kavura, as the Yerushalmi tells us. Hey, Vinu, the Jewish people, the leaders of the Jewish people, Chachamim felt, Ki Yisrael se'echad bein shivim ze'evim. The Jewish people are not going to be nomads and gypsies like wandering amongst the rest of the world. But no, they're a unique sheep among the 70 wolves. They are unique. And the Jewish people throughout their history will be able to survive. And when the waves will try to come to envelop them, despite all the troubles that did happen throughout our diaspora, the Jewish people, for some reason, with their commitment to Torah and mitzvos, still will survive. L'chein, says the Meshech Chachma, tiknu atova meitiv al kiyum umma. This bracha of Hatova Meitiv is a bracha of the Kiyum Ha'uma, the fact that the Jewish people survived. Moshe was the first bracha is Moshe, the Man, Hashgacha Pratis. The second bracha is Eretz Yisrael, is Bris, is Torah. The third bracha is Yerushalayim in the Beis Hamikdash. And the fourth bracha is the existence and the continued existence of Klal Yisrael. Umikiyum ha'uma pili lamanu ki nemar divrei nevi'enu v'divrei avaseinu shenchilo anu marasha b'amunas uman kol hanaga alakis b'vinyan Yerushalayim aretz. And the fact that Klal Yisrael still survives despite everything that's happened to it shows that the words of the Nevi'im, that we heard back in Eretz Yisrael and Yerushalayim are all true. That is the concept of this bracha, hatova meitiv. Okay, so that answers the question about what's the reason for this bracha to have been established. But what about the second question, the Meshech Chachmei asked about the yayin, the wine? Listen to this. L'chein al yayin tiknu hatova meitiv. But they made the Chazal established on when you have wine, special wine, we make a bracha on meitiv. Kizem plis tamim deyam asher uma kazu b'nimusam ke'ela asher asalam chitur. Moshe Amar al Krag also Yehuda Akumenam Golim. Okay, we'll skip the parentheses. Yisrael Shem Naga Akum Beyeno Asur Lo Lishtos. What was the symbol of our being special and unique amongst the when we're amongst the rest of the world? Wine. The Isser of Yain Nesech, of having Stam Yenam, of having wine of the non-Jews. That is to prevent intermarriage. It's to prevent us from fraternizing with them. It's to keep us separate and unique. That's what wine represents. Okay, and we have to wash the cup. We have to rinse it out if they touched our wine. It becomes also for us. We have been able to survive. That's the tzedakah of us being scattered amongst the world. That's what the bracha of the wine represents. HaKadosh Baruch Hu's with us. And even though we are separate and we have been dispersed amongst the world, we've remained unique. We've remained Am Yisrael, because of our adherence to being different than everybody else, symbolized by wine, and established in a bracha that HaKadosh Baruch Hu watches over us despite everything that happens around us. Meshech Chachma on benching and Atova Meitiv. And finally, as we conclude this week's parsha, we are going to look at a pasuk that we say twice a day, pasuk in Shema, which is at the end of Parshas Eikev. The pasuk says, we all know the pasuk, you should teach your children to speak in them, when you're sitting in your home, when you are walking on the way, and when you lay down and when you get up in the morning. Says the Ksav Sofer. First of all, what's the Torah telling us? We understand the idea you have to teach your children Torah, but it says, and moreover than that, it's a little bit strange because it says Lamadatem osam as b'neichem, your sons, plural, and then it should say b'shiftachem b'veiseichem, when you live in your houses, plural, etc. But then it switches to singular. Lamadatem osam as b'neichem, your sons, again plural, b'shiftacha b'veisecha, when you're sitting in your house, uvelechtecha v'aderech, when you walk on the ways. What is the singular and the plural in the same pasuk? Says the Ksav Sofer, V'nirali, Dine, HaTorah Tila Chilav al Ha'ava Sheyimdu B'neihem V'yichankim B'Torah. The Torah placed a requirement on fathers, Sheyilmadu B'neihem V'yichankim B'Torah, that they should teach their children and they should educate them in Torah. Aval, Lo Dai Shem Mashkichim Aleim Loleches B'Darchei Hashem V'yasu Machmas Hamora Kemitzvas Avosa. He said it's not enough that they will watch over them and teach them in the ways of Hashem, and they'll, out of fear, to do what their parents did. That only helps if you're, I don't want my father to see what I do. I don't want, I'm scared of him. Rak Kozman Shavos Eitzel B'neihem. Only when the parents are over their sons. The sons don't want to disappoint the father, so to speak. So whenever they're there, so he wants to watch over them. If a child is not with his parent, or after the parents are no longer alive, a kid will do whatever he wants. If he's only doing it because his father's there and his father told him to do it, he doesn't want to disappoint his father, he doesn't want to cross his father, so then he's going to do it. But in the event that his father's not there or he's not around his father, the kid will do whatever he wants to do. The chiyuv is not that he just teaches him Torah, but the parents, the father, the educators really, but it's really on the parents' responsibility to teach the children things, miskabel malalev, things that will touch the heart. And it should engrave upon them faith and knowledge. That with their eyes they see and with their hearts they can understand. That being an Eved Hashem and keeping the mitzvos is the right thing to do, whether or not my father told me to do it, but it's the right thing. And then a person will not deviate from the path of life. The Yishma mitzvos Hashem anachariso, and keep mitzvos, and he will keep mitzvos his entire life. And that's the pasuk in Mishlei that it says, which a pasuk again that we all know. Chanoch lenar al pidarko. You should educate the child based on his path. Gam ki yazkin lo yasur mimena. And even when he grows old, it shouldn't be taken away from him. You should teach him in this way that it is confident in your heart, Gam ki yazkin, that even when he gets old, and you're not watching over him, Gam ken lo yasur mimenu, then it still won't be removed from him. Kavonas, and that's what the pasuk means. Again, a pasuk that we say every day. You should teach your children to speak in them. Not only when you're home. Also when you're on the road, also when you lay down and when you get up. You should always be conversing and talking in Torah. And your eyes and your heart should be to Hashem. Your whole life should be showing your children how you're an Eved Hashem, how that's your life. And that's what it says in Parshas Vayera. Moshe, Avram Avinu, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Avram Avinu, "L'man asher yitzaveh es bincha es beiso acharav v'shamru derech Hashem la'asos tzedakah u'mishpat." Okay, that's what it says. L'man yitzaveh es beiso v'zbanav acharav hainu sheyitzavim. You have to command them ba'ofan zeh, in such a fashion. Even after you pass and you're not in the world anymore, nevertheless, as the pasuk continues, they will keep the words of Hashem to do tzedakah mishpat. And how does our pasuk here in Parshas Eikev and Kriya Shema conclude? Because if your son, your children follow in your footsteps, then your legacy lives on. Ubra mezaka abba, and the child is mezaka the father. Ba'olam haba, he's mezaka the father in olam haba. Ki'ilu odenu chai omed lifnei Hashem. And is as if he's still alive in front of Hashem if your son carries on what you taught him, and that you're never Hashem. That their lives should be together. How do you do that? If the son follows in this child's footsteps, Yachad of Bno, father and son together, and that's easy to understand. Parshas Eikev.